Hey, I'm Josh at Anesthetic Design, and welcome to my first ever video. I've been making graphic art for 20 years now, and today is the start of me trying to give back some of the information I've absorbed over the years. And yeah, today's video starts, it comes from a request from a follower and a peer about how I apply my textures in my work. If you take a quick look through the feed behind, if you're not familiar with my work, it's pretty texture heavy, to say the least. I layer it on thick, and that's how I like it. And yeah, they asked how I apply my textures. I wanted to answer that in like a three-part kind of video, where I start with like why I work this way, to kind of give you an idea of what I'm trying to achieve. It's not just slapping down textures willy-nilly, and if you know the why before the how, you can kind of decide if that works for your workflow. Then I will take you through how. We'll look through a couple of my files, my own personal files that will break it down of how they were built, and then we'll take you through a tutorial on how to build this bad boy. We're going to, let me just turn, I think I'm clipping. We'll see. First stream, audio issues, video issues. Leave a comment, let me know how it sounds, how it looks. Any feedback is welcome. But yeah, there's a link in the description to download all the elements to build this piece you see behind you. So if you want to download those now, if you're watching the stream, and you can design along later, or you can use the magic of YouTube to skip ahead and just do the tutorial, if that's what you fancy. And yeah, so first off, as I said, I was going to explain a little bit about why I apply texture in the way that I do. So it stemmed from previously my style was kind of trying to work with halftone and the filters in Photoshop. I was basically just using halftone filters in Photoshop, which meant that when you were looking up close at the artwork, it was kind of not really flat like it would print. So there was a lot of work in getting files ready to send to print. Going through to my old work here, where you can see, if I can zoom in on one that isn't a video, so you can kind of see what I mean here about the texture in it. Like, it's still very granular. It's not just a flat texture like a screen would be. So I wanted to start building my artworks like they would screen print, whether it was a one color or a two color, instead of having this kind of stuff would really need to be printed DTG, direct to garment, which is not how bands often work. I sold quite a few of these style artworks to brands who did do DTG, but I wanted to work more with bands starting in 2023 and 2024, which is why I developed the style that you know today, which is just very flat and works much better for printing. You can see like this is super clean, super crisp. And basically, if somebody wants a file of this, it's pretty much ready, apart from just a bit of flattening and whatnot. That is why I built it this way initially. And the idea behind the texturing layers was trying to recreate halftone with texture, if you understand what I mean. Like, in a halftone image, for the lighter areas you would have a very small, or the darker areas you'd have a very, very small dot of white. For the medium areas, it'd be bigger dots or heavier dots or a larger amount of dots, and then in the white area you'd have solid white. So same for this. If I take you now through this file that I built, this is a pre-made piece that I made in 2024. So you can see in the layers here, if I take them off, you can see the top layer is basically pure white. And then underneath that is where the texture starts. So underneath, the layer underneath kind of like still uses texture to be like a mid-tone. Imagine if it was grayscale, it would be a black, a grey, and a white. There's your white. This layer here is your grey, and then there's a layer underneath which is darker still. These layers are screened over the top of each other, so they are threshold smart objects. Basically a smart object of this image, which I built, I created in DAZ Studio. If you know DAZ Studio, it is a fab piece of software for working with characters. It allows you to pose, manipulate, dress characters without having to have like intimate knowledge of super deep 3D software. I can work in Blender a little bit for sculpting and for modeling, but when it comes to actually like sculpting a character, dressing a character, etc., it's much easier to buy some assets from DAZ and build your characters there. I'll be doing another stream on how to use DAZ and how you can create those characters for your own work. But yeah, so this character is a smart object, which you then layer up in Photoshop. So this, if I just break it down to the bottom layer, that is the character thresholded to a point, which you layer your chosen texture over the top of, and then put the next layer over the top of that, which will have a bit more detail to it, and that is screened over the top of the whole thing, and then you multiply the texture on top of the screen, so it kind of like destroys it a little bit. You add in the detail with the thresholded image, and you destroy it again with the texture. And you can build that up as many times as you want. This one is done in 3, some are done in more. This is a recent piece I made for Impurist for their upcoming EP. It releases in a few days actually, their EP, Evolving Cortex. And they wanted a character being strangled by these tentacles that come out of his own face, as you do. And again, very similar thing. So this is a sculpt that I made in Blender, and you do all the tweaks you want to in Photoshop. Like you can darken up areas. You can see I added in some shadow here, some extra shadowing on the side of the nose to make it kind of stand out. Get the eyes really white, get the sculpt in the head really white so it pops out. And you can, the reason why I love smart objects so much is because you can do these adjustments in the smart object and then apply your textures and see how they look, see what levels of threshold you need for each layer, see how the textures are looking working on there, and then once you've got it kind of built up, if you do need to do any further adjustments, you can go back into the smart object and adjust further. That was one thing I needed to do with this one, because of the lighting. Once I'd applied all the textures, the face was kind of destroyed, and it's going to be like small on a CD or like even on a Spotify stream or something. It's going to be really tiny. So you need it to be really quite obvious that it is a face. Faces are good for that because human beings like to pick out faces, so they're quite easy to make obvious what they are, a human face. But that said, you do still need to make sure you have enough shadow and light in there so that it's really obvious what it is when you shrink it right down. This one, to go into a bit more depth, let's delete hidden layers. Try and clean it up a bit. So this one is built with colour, as well as so that one is basically just a completely white image, which obviously threshold is good for working with and makes it quite simple. And then the colour is just vector images plastered over the top. This one was going to be full colour. I still wanted it to look like my style, so it's still flat, so it would work well with the t-shirts that they wanted printed as well. But yeah, so the colorations are, it's built the same way, all in white, and then the colors are built up in gradient maps over the top, and the gradient maps work super well with it because it's just flat color. You don't need to worry too much about fancy. It's black to white is the gradient. So the darker color, if you don't know how a gradient map works, on the darker color, that maps to whatever is black, and the lighter color maps to whatever is white. So if you were using a gradiated image, it would map that over the top of the whole thing. But because we're just using completely black and white, it just uses the two values. And then, yeah, you just go in and map out what you want where, which colours you want in which place, and it will build it up for you. If we look at how the actual layering is built on this one, it's really, really heavily textured, this one, because Impurist wanted it super gnarly. They are a old school death metal band. If you haven't checked them out, definitely do. Old school death metal, really gnarly, and they wanted it to look super gnarly. So you can see I've applied 2 different textures on top of even the very top one there, because oh no, there's the white one on top. Yeah, so there's the white on top there. And yeah, it's built very much the same way as the last one. If you do need to have white on top of colours, but you don't want it to kind of, you know, sometimes when you screen things over the top, if it's not 100% white, it can muddy up with the colours that are underneath it. What you can do is come into blending modes. If you click to the right of the title of your layer, you can open up blending modes, which is in your layer style, the same place you would find your strokes and your bevel, emboss and whatnot. But in this section here, if you can like, see if I pull it the other way. So imagine it's the other way because this is white, but basically you can drag these values out and they knock out that color. So if you wanted to just instead of screening it over the layer, if you wanted to knock out the black, that's another way of doing it, and that can be really effective if you're layering up things that don't work so well with the screen and multiply technique that we're going to go through today. And this is the artwork that we are going to build now. We're going to take a look at how I would build a simple artwork. So this main background is black, very similar to this image. The main background is black and white, so it's nice and easy to build up with screen and multiply for your first attempt. And yeah, then I'll show you how to add the other elements around it and color them up with a gradient map. So if we close all these. We are going to start a new file. I personally work really big and really high res because it helps when things go to print. If you, even if you're just mucking around, if you do something and someone says, "Oh, I like that actually, can you sort this out?" then you've already got it high res, ready to go, and it doesn't take too much work to make it print. You're welcome to work at whatever size you want, either a lower DPI or a smaller size. If your machine is slow, or personal preference, that is absolutely fine. So the background, I want you to press Command or Command or Control if you're on Mac or Windows. I'm actually on Windows, so I don't know why I said Command, but I've just realized my keyboard says Command. So apparently this is a Mac keyboard. I hadn't even noticed. Fill the background black with Control Backspace. If you hit Control Backspace and it goes white, then hit X and it will switch your palette around, and hit Control Backspace to make it black. Now I want you to grab from the elements that you've downloaded already. Definitely you have them, don't you? You do have them, don't you? You don't need to pause and go and get them. Grab the skull, chuck him in there, big old boy, big old scully boy, and hit rasterize layer on there for now. So we've got this skull that was from, where did I take a photograph of him? The National History Museum in Lille in France, I believe, is where this guy is from. He had cobwebs and springs holding the jaw together and whatever. I've cleaned them all up and he's ready to go. Now you've rasterized the layer, I want you to convert to Smart Object. That is so that when we apply a threshold or any filter, like a blur or anything you want to, if you make it a Smart Object, when you apply a filter, that filter becomes a smart filter, which you can then double click again and go back and change it. So like if you just had a flat layer and you, well, let's show you. So this one is rasterized and it's just like a PNG that I've dropped in there, and I go to threshold, which is in image, adjustments, and then threshold. Here you can make it look really cool and you're like, oh yeah, it's really cool, but I'll make it super dark, and then you have your image here. But then you're like, oh, I want some of the data back, but you'd have to Control Z and go back and then come back in here and hit threshold again. Whereas when you have a nice fancy Smart Object, again, these can slow older computers or laptops down. So if you need to, you can just work with flat layers. Just keep a separate hidden layer of the original, just in case you save it and you haven't kept a PNG of the image or anything like that elsewhere. Duplicate it up and kind of keep it to the side. Here we're going to apply our thresholding. So again, that's image, adjustments, threshold, and we can make our adjustments. I start with one which is like quite, not totally white out, but just a little bit of super dark detail coming in. This is at about 40 there, and then once you have that, you can duplicate the layers up and manipulate them in any way you want to, and then you can just double click where it says threshold under the smart filters, and you can just change it again straight away. Makes things super simple, nice and quick. And again, the added benefit of having the Smart Object is double click and you open into the Smart Object here. So if you realize that the eyes aren't dark enough for you, you can duplicate that up, multiply, and just draw in a bit more shadow in the eye areas if you wanted to. I've already adjusted this image, so it's spot on for what we're doing, but if you wanted to, for personal preference, you could come into the smart object and update it. With more complex images, it quite often, skulls are great because the skull's a skull, they look like a skull when you do them graphically. It's always going to look like a skull. But with more complex imagery, sometimes you'll need to go in and do those fine tweaks, which is exactly what smart objects are really good for. So once you have your first layer, your smart object set up, you've thresholded it to the level 40, I think it was. Yeah, you went into image adjustments, threshold, you did threshold, the setting at about 40, so you've just got a little bit of the black detail in there. I want you to take the super heavy texture. We're going to start, so we're going to go from darkest to the lightest, so the super heavy texture is where we're going to start. This is from my my texture pack, texture 1. That's the first pack I put up. It's 100 textures. These are like really brutal heavy textures that I put together myself because there wasn't really anything on the market that worked for what I wanted to do. I think I started out with a bunch of textures from True Grit Texture Supply, and they're great, really fine grainy splashy textures and things like that, fab for that kind of thing. But if you want, and anytime I was doing anything with like really heavy brutal texture, such as this, there just wasn't enough. So this is built up of various photographs and textures I've made, ran through a threshold and upscaled. Upscaled before they were thresholded. So they are 16K resolution, 1200 DPI TIFF files that you can get from my website, which is in the link below. If you find that these textures work for you, the ones that you've downloaded today are free, totally free for you to use. They are from the pack and give you a good idea of the kind of quality that you're looking at, if that sort of thing is for you. Once you've dropped your texture in and you've resized it so that it sort of covers the skull, hold Alt and click between the two layers, between the texture layer and the skull layer, and it will create a clipping mask where the texture is clipped over the top of the skull, so it will only appear on where the skull is. On the layer modes, change the layer mode to multiply, and you'll see if you switch between multiply and normal, you can just see the dark details pop through there. It's only a little bit, but it just starts building up that image if you see what we're going for. One thing I want you to think about when you're applying textures is you're not just slapping this on there. Think about the base image and what it might look like. If you need to, go back and have a look at the reference and like, where is the light hitting it? Which direction is the light coming from? We've got the light hitting the side of the skull from the right. So what you might want to do, if the texture has that kind of a lighter area, you see here, this kind of area here, that kind of begins to build a highlight on the brow of the skull there and on the top of it. So if you think about where you pop your textures, it makes the texture work harder rather than just being a splat of texture. The texture itself begins to build up the image. Now that you've got that first layer sorted, grab your smart object of the skull and hold Alt again and drag it upwards to duplicate it up above your texture layer. Now this one was set to normal before because it was the base layer. These ones above, these layers above, I want you to set to screen. And what you'll see when you come in and edit this threshold, we're going to start pulling darkness away from the threshold, and all that lovely detail starts coming out, and you see there the detail with the detail with the texture as well starts to build up that really gritty sort of vibe, which is exactly what we're going for, and works well with a gnarly skull like this as well. Sometimes you'll find finer textures will work better with a finer detail image, particularly if it's like a landscape. You might find some leafy textures. If you're working with an image of a wolf, you might find a furry texture that works well down the side of it. Make your textures work with the image. Don't just slap on the textures that you bought from wherever. Think about how you apply them. Somewhat. Sometimes you can just slap them on and you have a happy accident and it looks great. But yeah, just a thought. So here you've got your highlights there. We want to come in the middle somewhere, so probably like there-ish is where it starts looking really cool. So we're adding the detail back in with the threshold layer, and then again we're destroying it again with the texture. This time I want you to grab the middling texture, which is texture 19. Drop that in here, and yet again we go over the top. I'm going to, because the light comes from above and you can see the texture is darker at the top, I'm going to flip vertical that, which you just right click and flip vertical, so the light is coming from the top of that sort of gravelly texture there. And again, alt click between the two layers, it clips to the skull layer, and then change the blending mode to screen. Change the blending mode to multiply. Do as I say, not as I do. Just do it wrong. Just do it completely wrong. And here we have, your texture again over the top of the skull. And so you can see it's starting to build up with the dark. You can, when you know it's going to work well, when you can really tell the difference between the two layers straight away. You've got the dark layer, you've got the midtone, so you know that once you apply the highlight, the whole image is going to pop really nicely. Pop. I shouldn't say pop, should I? That's the forbidden designer word. Make it pop. Make it pop. Don't do that. Don't make it pop. Right. We're going to so you once again with your image here duplicate this skull layer by holding Alt and drag it up above everything else again, and then threshold, this is the final one, so we're going to drag it down until we've got kind of like, you see the highlights, kind of like, I want the top of that skull, and I don't know if you can see in here, I just want to get some of that highlight, go away, some of that highlight popping in there on the top of the bridge of the nose, and it just really, it builds up that image really nicely, you know. And what we're going to use for this last one is the lighter texture number 35. You're going to see this is kind of like a woody texture, which works nicely for bone as well, because it's kind of like old and crackly. Again, I'm going to flip vertical, and then I'm going to flip horizontal as well, so the light to dark of the texture follows the light to dark of the image itself as well. Make sure your texture is large enough to, these are crazy high res, so you can blow them up as big as you want, and make sure that you've made it cover the image where you want to apply it, and alt click between the two layers clip that to your skull, and then again change the blend mode to multiply, and here we go. We've got a nice texture in there on the highlight, but a texture that's light enough to not destroy the highlights too much. Sometimes when you try to work with a super clean image, you just have nothing on the highlights, but with something gnarly and dirty like this, it's nice to just have texture working across the whole thing. And yeah, the skull is already looking pretty cool, if you ask me. Why don't you go ahead and select all of your layers so far, hit Control G, and call your group skull, because it is. Save your work. Oh my gosh, that should have been the first thing we did. Where's the desktop? The panic, the sheer panic when you get partway through your file and realize that your file is still called untitled and you haven't saved it yet. We got lucky. That would have been wonderful on stream, but it would have been real, you know, the real design struggle of you click out and realize that you haven't even saved what you're on with. So next we're going to bring in the element. That is this SVG file. If you just drag that and drop that into, oh, happy accident there, that looks pretty cool, doesn't it? Drag and drop into Photoshop, you'll see in your layers that it's just a vector element. So again, vector, you can scale up and take it down as much as you want. And on top of that, we're going to apply this cracked pavement texture over the top of the wreath. So I'm just going to make that pretty big so that it definitely covers the whole wreath. And then again, Alt, click between the two layers, and here we have the texture on top of the element. So you can just manipulate and mess around with the element itself as much as you want, and the texture will stay on top of it. I want a pop of color in this piece, and this wreath, like graphic element, is a perfect place to do it because the skull looks great in white, super clean and punchy against the black, and then a little splash of color helps to really make it stand out. Trying not to use the word pop again. So if you come down to the bottom of your layers tab and click the little yin yang looking symbol, you can, the second one up is gradient map. If you click that, when you, I don't know why it does this, when you open a new gradient map, it always has the mask selected. So then when you try and change the colors and you color pick stuff, it's just black and white because it's on the mask. So what it helps to do is click on the layer itself, and then you can, when you click on the layer, this little editor will come up, and you can click that gradient, which is currently black to white, which is why it still looks black to white, and edit these little nodes here. So that node is black, which is perfect, that's what we want. This node here, we are going to make a nice bright color. I've not clipped it so it's colouring the whole image, but for right now I'm going to make it like a just slightly pinky red, but you can make it really whatever colour you want. If you black, white and yellow looks really good, black, white and red looks great, black, white and like a vibrant teal kind of colour looks really cool. What I want you to do now is, again, Alt and click between the gradient map and the texture, and that will only apply the gradient map to the texture. So you could now go ahead and adjust this any way you want. You can have it like behind the skull and knock it out. You can have it go all the way around it. As you can see from my file that I showed you earlier, I have it kind of running through the teeth and then coming up around the top of the skull. So I want it sized so that the wreath kind of follows the curvature of the top of the skull, but then also comes right through here where the teeth are, so that we can mask it out and make it look like the skull is holding that wreath in its teeth. To do that, what I want you to do is, with your wreath layer selected, come down to the bottom of the layer panel and click the rectangle with a little circle in the middle of it. That is layer masks. That will create a layer mask. And then if you zoom in to this area, hit B to find your brush, and if your brush is not hard already, I want you to make it hard. Here in the hardness box, click 100%, because that's how you need to be 100% hard for what we're about to do, and brush out. Make sure your brush is black. If it's black and white, again, hit X to go between the two. Make your brush black when you're brushing on the mask layer, and brush away this area behind the teeth. It can go into the black a little bit because that'll be like shadow, the shadow of the edge of the teeth. Brush out all that area that's definitely behind the teeth, and again, similar on this side, brush out the element that goes behind the teeth. Now, you can see here that we also have a little bit of it going over the top of the cheekbones. I quite like that over the top on that side, but on this side, I would like that cheekbone to be over the top of the wreath. Anything you can do in your work to add layering makes the design stand up off the page more. When you're working with flat color and flat imagery such as this, you need to add in as much layering as you can. So one thing over the top of another. A band logo behind the skull brings the skull forward. A design element that runs behind everything, like a square in the background that goes behind everything else, brings the whole design forward, because that, if it's on a t-shirt, that back element kind of sits on the t-shirt, and everything else that's on top of it, so the band logo that's on top sits above the background, but then the skull that's on top of the band logo sits above that. So you can visually layer things to make things really stand out, even though you're just working with flat color. In this case, what we're going to do is find one of our skull layers, and you're going to hit Control, and you're going to click on the layer, and that is going to select the very edge of your layer. You see your little marching ants. That's what my design tutor always used to call them, the marching ants going around the edge of the selection. And because you've got that selected now, you can just brush in black and get rid of that wreath element there, so it's on one, so it goes behind the teeth, and then on one side the wreath is in front of the skull, but on the other side the skull is in front of the wreath, which gives it a visual skew. In a sense, it feels like it's in a 3D space where the skull is kind of like moving around this flaming thorny wreath, I guess crown of thorns kind of vibe, doodad. This is also an element that I built in Vector. It's not available yet. I'm building up a pack of Vector elements. There is a pack on my website of Vector band logos for bands that don't exist. I always used to hate, when people put like a Lorna Shore logo on a design they've done, or a Carnifex logo on a design they've done, and they've like, it's not really for Lorna Shore or Carnifex, I've just put it there to grab attention. I didn't like that, so I made a bunch of logos for bands that didn't exist and use those instead. So if you want to use those for your designs, they're available on my website too. Now we've got this looking pretty good, and I think it just needs some glowing eyes. Some glowing eyes to finish it all off. And the cool thing about a glowing eye is it's just a circle when you're working with flat color. So go to your tools, select your circle. You can just hit U if you've got the ellipse selected. Well, the U just selects the shape, whichever one you had last. Yeah, select your ellipse tools to make a nice circle, and make it kinda whatever size you like, really. On a new layer, of course. Make a new layer, draw your circle to be whatever size you like, and center it in the middle of the eye socket, I suppose. And then what I want you to do is hold Alt and just drag across to the other side up to about the middle, where you've got the two eyes in the center. They actually look kind of cool just in white there, just like really standing out in the middle of the thing. But I want those to match with my wreath, to be in the same red with the same texture. So take your two layers that you've just made of your little circles. You can name them up as circle if you want, but I'm doing it quick and dirty style. So you can hit Control G, and that will group them together. And the cool thing about the latest versions of Photoshop, if you got one, is that now you can apply clipping direct to a group, which is a lifesaver. Select the gradient map and the texture of that you used for the wreath, and hold Alt, drag it up to the top above the group, ideally, yeah, above the group, and then again holding Alt, just click between the two layers so that it applies the texture to the circles, and then the gradient map to the texture, and then it's all colored up, and you will have an approximation of this on your screen too, which is pretty freaking cool, isn't it? Because you've just built a file the exact same way I do. The magic of the internet. I encourage you to continue playing around a little bit more and do it a bit differently. Color up the eyes differently, do them in a different way. Maybe you just want one side lit up. Maybe you don't like the eyes at all. Maybe you want the wreath larger around the entire thing. Maybe you want it to go around a different part. Maybe you just want it floating around its head in the background. Maybe you want to color it up a different way. However you fancy doing it, I would recommend going back into the file and having a play around, because that is how you really learn. I'm happy that you've reached this point with me, but doing a little bit extra yourself will net you just that extra bit of understanding about how that all works. And I recommend that with any tutorial, to be honest. Do it your own way a little bit. If you've got exactly this on your screen right now, that's great. You've got a good understanding of how that was built and how it all works. But playing around with the file itself a little bit longer, and maybe you want to do something that you don't quite know how to do, so you have to Google it, and the process of Googling it and finding out how to do it yourself kind of solidifies it all in your head a little bit better when you just look into things and do it yourself. So I always recommend doing that with your tutorials, and anytime I do a tutorial, I will give you that same spiel afterwards and recommend you do the same. Yeah, that's everything then. We've built, I told you the why of why I build files this way. I told you the how with my own files, and now together we have built this cool looking piece of artwork that you can call your own. And I think that is everything. I could probably continue waffling on about texture forever, but I promised myself I would cut this short before we reached waffle territory. As such, let's leave it there. If you're in a band or have a brand that needs some gnarly artwork, or a brutal logo, feel free to get in touch. If you're an artist like me and you've been following along, the links are in the description to my website, where you can get hold of the elements we've been using today, with 15% off your first order. Like, subscribe, and all that jazz. Cheers for checking me out. I'll be back a similar time next week. I hope you have a good one. Cheers.